Hello, my name is Mariah Lamore and welcome to my YouTube channel. It's been 2 weeks since I posted my first video and it's going good. It's going fine. At the end of my last video I promised that I was going to make something for my cat this time, and I had a hard time deciding what that was, because I was going to tell you how I had upgraded a cat tree that I bought online, and a lot of the stuff that I was going to do to that didn't quite work out. So I was trying to brainstorm other ideas and eventually came on what I'm doing for you today, which is I'm just putting a nice soft liner inside of an Easter basket that my parents brought me and my husband last weekend, which was super cool. We had all the chocolate and then we had this basket left over, and I was like, you know what, this would be great for a tiny little cat to sit in. Scoot, scoot. Meow. This is our newest little addition to the family, Eglantine.
Eglantine. Eglantine, Eglantine, oh how you'll shine.
Or Egg for short. We picked her up on Sunday and she's been spending a lot of time getting used to everything. She's very talky. She's a very conversational little cat. Yeah, and now that I woke her up, she wants to explore. She hasn't been in the library yet. Oh no. So she's been settling in. It's been really nice to be home all the time and working from home and everything, because it gives us a chance to stay home with her and make sure that she's not getting into anything crazy and generally just adjusting well. Yeah. We get to give you lots of snugs. She's watching herself in the camera. Yeah, you're cute. Oh, and we hear Nora outside. She's wondering what we're talking about. So yeah, now that you've met this tiny egg, let's get started with the project, shall we? So the first thing I did was I made a pattern for this, and what I used for paper is a roll of medical paper, the stuff they put over examination tables in clinics. That stuff works like tracing paper. It's really good for making patterns. It's pretty cheap. You can buy it by the roll. So I cut a piece that was about the right size and I just tucked it into the basket and then traced along the crease around the inside. The shape that I traced wasn't perfectly round. It was, crinkly and kind of messy, and so I grabbed a dinner plate, hoping that it would at least help me draw the curves nicer, and discovered that this plate is about the exact right size. I added about 1/8 of an inch around the edge for some extra seam allowance, but otherwise it was pretty much perfect. To make the pattern for around the sides of the basket, I just traced around the outside of the basket. I chose the point where the handle connects to the basket as my starting point and traced both the bottom edge of the basket and the top edge, and just carefully move it along the edge, kind of rolling however it naturally rolls, and that'll give you at least an approximate curve. I drew on a seam allowance, and then here is probably the most important part of this, is truing your pattern. To true a pattern, I chose a point on my circle and made a little mark, and then you line up that mark with basically however these are going to get sewed together. Line them up and carefully walk one pattern piece along the other, along the seam allowance, making sure that the edge is the same length. You can also do this by measuring each one, but I like this visual way of seeing that they line up nicely how they're supposed to. This is a good thing to do on any pattern, not just a circle, but for the circle specifically, it made sure that I wasn't going to have to do any easing or gathering to get the side piece to fit onto the bottom. Alright, and with that done, I chose this super cute fleece remnant with little campers and tents and whatnot on it. When I laid this out, I realized that the pattern on the fleece was not going to be straight around the whole edge of the basket because it's this curved shape. So to kind of offset that a little bit, I decided to cut my pattern in half so that I could essentially straighten out this pattern piece a little bit. So I just folded it in half. I was really anxious to cut it up, but then I remembered seam allowances. Seam allowances are important. Another thing to note for seam allowances is that the corners where your side seam meets the top and bottom should be as close to 90 degrees as you can make them. Again, truing up the seams, truing up the edges, making sure that they're the same length so that when I sew all the side seams together, one edge isn't going to be drastically longer than the other and I won't have to do any trimming later. So there's my new pattern piece. I laid this out on my fabric and pinned it down and cut it all out. Pin, pin, pin. Snip, 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 snip. It was a really interesting process trying to film this because I have not had to work around a camera before. I have not had to worry about someone else trying to see what I'm doing. So this was a very interesting experience overall. Definitely learned a lot. We'll be able to make more interesting videos in the future. Hopefully some better angles. Some better more exciting projects. Mostly that. I realized kind of late in the game too that this was not going to be the easiest thing to film because I was essentially doing everything twice. And when you do every step twice, you essentially end up with a very long video of just the same old stuff happening over and over again. But it was good. It was good. So, now my flannel. I was going to do this exactly the same way as I did the fleece, but what I did instead, and this has worked relatively well for me in the past, I just took my fleece pattern pieces and laid them out all at once. I did a lot of what, for about a semester in college, I worked in a costume shop, and a lot of this kind of fiddly business that I'm doing with my fingers we called fabric whispering to get everything to lay out as exactly as I can get it. I laid down my paper pattern piece on top of them just to make sure nothing was too crooked or stretched out or wildly different than it should have been, and that again will just help for everything fitting together later. Why was I pinning on top of another sheet of fabric? Boy, I do not know. It was not the best choice. I thought I was gonna cut that stuff up. The fabric that I'm doing everything on top of in this video is actually a bed sheet that I'm gonna turn into a chemise or chemise, whichever way you say that. One way is a little bit more French sounding. That's probably the right one. For a 1700s costume that I'm working on, kind of mid to late 1700s. Well, that's maybe not true. 1700s-ish costume that I'm going to be working on. Hopefully soon. Hopefully that's what I'll be doing next. Is making that. We'll see. So I had all my pieces still pinned together, just separate them. Figure out which side's the right side and what side's the wrong side. For these fabrics, it didn't really matter. Fleece tends to have an ever so slightly fluffier side and an ever so slightly smoother side. So I picked around a bit and figured out which side I wanted to be on the outside. Line up your side seams, pin them together. Because I knew that I was going to have a cuff that went over the top of my basket, and the handle of the basket was going to be in the way of that, making the sides in two pieces was actually very convenient, because then I was able to leave part of the side open. To measure where the split was going to be for the handle, I just used the basket itself, pinched the approximate seam allowance, and determined where the top of the basket was. Line it back up and pin. Once you get the first side figured out, you can use that as a guideline for where the split should go on the other side as well. Ta-da! And just sew it up. And here we go. Nice little split at the top for the handle. Second verse, same as the first. Ideally, always press your seams, but I was lazy, and so I just gave them a quick crease with my fingers, a quick little massage, and that, for the most part, kept them open and flat and looking pretty nice. Time to put the bottom on. There again, I figured out how I wanted the pattern to sit and what side was the slightly fluffier side, and that was going to be my outside. And then just line up the edge of the bottom with the shorter curve of the side piece, right sides together, and pin. It's a little bit tricky to sew a concave curve onto a convex curve, but there's not really a trick to it. Just stick a lot of pins in it. Just go slow. Scoot your fabric really gently, try not to stretch anything. I guess there is one little trick. One little trick I do is I tend to start with the bigger piece, the whole piece, the piece with the hole in it. I tend to start with that flat, and then about halfway, when it naturally wants to curve in on itself, then I flip that piece inside out and I keep pinning from there instead of trying to... I don't know, that just works for me a little bit better. I don't know if that makes sense. And then generally when I have a curve like this too, I like to take the flattest piece and sew with that piece on top. That way it kind of lets me control the shape of the seam a little bit better. That's kind of the guideline piece. You want it to be in this circle shape, so you put the circle shape on top, and that can guide the bottom fabric into the right configuration instead of having that kind of slip around and stretch and whatnot. It kind of keeps all of the folds under control too. There's going to be a lot of folding underneath that top layer because the bottom layer is wider. Just make sure you don't catch any folds in the seam. You can generally feel them through that top layer and kind of massage them out. Voila! It's now a basket shape. Now if you wanted to just have one layer, this would be really all you need to do, just slap it in the basket. But I decided on 2 layers so that it could be reversible and maybe a little bit warmer. And the next part of this is we're going to sew it together kind of like a pillow. Make sure you line up the side seams. Don't do it wrong sides together like I'm doing here. Do it right sides together. Do it with the seams facing outward because you're going to want to turn it around. And then I start with the corners because they are also very easy to line up. You're going to want to sew all the way around the top, including the little splits. Although don't make the mistake that I made in actually sewing all the way around the top. Leave yourself a bit of that top curve open on one side so that you actually have a hole to pull everything out the right way again. Otherwise you're just going to be stuck with this solid inside out thing and you're not going to be able to turn it around. I actually had to pick out part of my seam because I forgot about this. When you're sewing the split part, you're going to meet up with the side seam. Make sure when you do this to pull all the seam allowances to one side so that you can see where the seams are going to line up. When you're all done, clip the corners so that they turn out nice and don't get all bunchy. Stick your hand right in that hole that you left for yourself on the top and pull everything right side out. Just like a big pillow. You're gonna have to ease out those little corners a bit, kind of massage them into the right shape. Just give them a little wiggle. There they are. Smush, smush, smush. A little wiggle, and there's a nice little corner. You could top stitch this hole closed if you don't want to hand sew it, but if you don't want to see a big ugly seam right where you clearly turned this out, then do a little hand stitching. This is about as much hand stitching as I generally care to do. This is worth it, just to get a nice invisible seam. You could whip stitch it, you could do pretty much whatever you want. I do kind of like it's almost like a running stitch, but not a running stitch. I don't know what stitches are called. Whip stitch is pretty much what I've got in my vocabulary. Which was kind of another thing that when I worked in the costume shop drove the shop manager crazy. I knew how to do pretty much everything. I just had no idea what it was called. My knot got kind of funky there, but it's fine. With a little massaging, it's hidden. And here we go. And ended up fitting pretty well. At least as well as it needed to. Look at that. Beautiful. The only thing that I didn't really do was straighten out the top edge of my pattern. So the cuff isn't really even. It's a little wobbly, but not so much that anyone's really gonna notice. I'm thinking about putting little ribbons or buttons or something on the sides where the corners stick out, just to keep the liner locked down a little bit better, keep it from slipping around, but I'll figure that out another day, I think. For the time being, this is probably safer for this little cat to not have the extraneous bits like ribbons or buttons to chew on. Ta-da!
As the shine sells the boot and the blossoms the fruit, all you need to succeed in your plan is the proper ally upon whom to rely, and I'm your man.
Bye! You.